first heard the tolling on a night when the storm seemed to tear the sky open with its rage. Sheets of rain lashed against my bedroom window, and the wind howled through the trees like an anguished soul. I had just settled into bed, the steady patter of rain acting as a lullaby when the sound sliced through the storm. Dome. The note was low and resonant, vibrating deep in my chest. It carried a haunting clarity, unmuted by the thunder and wind. For a moment I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The clock tower at the edge of town, old and derelict for decades, was the only place that sound could have come from. Its bell hadn't rung in my lifetime. Not since the fire that gutted its interior years ago, leaving it a charred husk of stone and rusted metal. I told myself it was the storm playing tricks, lightning illuminating some distant sound, magnified by my imagination. But when the toll came again, it was unmistakable. Doom. The sound carried a weight, like it wasn't meant just to be heard, but to be felt. I sat up in bed, the hairs on my arms standing on end. My mind raced. The town had long abandoned the clock tower, calling it cursed after a series of tragic accidents. No one lived near it anymore. And yet, its bell rang clear as day. The next morning, I wasn't the only one talking about the sound. At the diner where I worked, customers whispered in hushed tones about hearing it too. Everyone agreed on the time. Midnight, exactly. By the afternoon, news broke that old Mr. Timmons, who lived on the outskirts of town, had passed away in his sleep. A neighbor found him that morning, his face pale and twisted with a look of terror. Coincidence, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. Whispers spread quickly, connecting the dots I didn't dare speak aloud. The clock tower tolls, and someone dies. It was absurd, of course. And yet the fear in people's eyes told me they believed it. The bell rang again the following night. This time, Mrs. Carrow, who ran the flower shop, didn't show up for work the next morning. Her husband found her collapsed in the garden, her hands clutched over her chest, her eyes wide and staring at the sky. No medical explanation could account for her sudden death. By the third toll, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. The deaths weren't natural. They were connected. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the clock tower was calling to me, daring me to come closer. The clock tower had always been a relic of mystery and unease in our small town. Even before it fell into disrepair, people treated it like an omen. Built in the late 1800s, it was once the pride of Black Hollow, a symbol of progress and prosperity. But it didn't take long for the tragedies to start. We huddled in the corner booth of the diner, a group of 4, myself, Ethan, Sarah, and Jenna. The mood was as gloomy as the storm clouds that hovered perpetually over the town. Jenna had brought a pile of old books and newspaper clippings she'd scavenged from her grandfather's attic, her face pale as she spread them across the table. Here. She jabbed a finger at a faded newspaper article from 1894. This is where it started. The headline read, "Clockmaker vanishes, mystery deepens around town bell." The story recounted how Matthias Cole, the man who had designed the clock tower, had disappeared mere weeks after its completion. Witnesses claimed to have heard strange noises emanating from the tower late at night, whispers, cries, and, once, a blood-curdling scream. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "What happened to him?" "No one knows," Jenna said, her voice low. "Some say he fell into the clock's inner workings and was ground to pieces. Others think he ran off. But there were rumors, stories about the clock being tied to some kind of ritual." Ethan frowned. "A ritual?" Jenna nodded grimly. The clockmaker was obsessed with the idea of capturing time. He believed he could trap it in the bell, bind it to the people of the town. But it went wrong. "What does that mean, went wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jenna didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid another clipping across the table. This one was dated a year after the first. The headline was more chilling than the last. Bell toll heralds death of Widow Thatcher. The article described how, after the clock tower mysteriously rang at midnight, Widow Thatcher was found dead the following morning. Her body was discovered under the clock tower, her face frozen in a rictus of terror. "It's happened before," I murmured, my stomach twisting. "This isn't new." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "So what? Are we supposed to believe this thing is cursed?" "We can't just ignore it," Jenna said, her eyes burning with determination. "People are dying. It's like the tower is choosing them." "Choosing them for what?" Sarah whispered. No one had an answer. The clock tower loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. The urge to go there grew stronger with every passing moment. As we stared at the yellowed clippings, the bell's chime rang in my memory, clear, resonant, and unrelenting. Doom. It wasn't just a sound, it was a call. And I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't done yet. The decision to visit the clock tower was unspoken, a silent agreement forged between our shared fear and curiosity. As we walked through the streets of Black Hollow, the town seemed to exhale dread. The usual chatter of the diner and hum of passing cars was replaced by an eerie quiet, as if even the town itself didn't dare draw attention to the tower. The path leading to the clock tower was overgrown, its cobblestones cracked and obscured by creeping ivy. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt, as though the place was cloaked in an invisible shroud of suffocating gloom. The clock tower's spire pierced the sky like a jagged blade, its stone face weathered and stained. The once proud bell, now blackened with age, hung motionless in the belfry. When we reached the base of the tower, Ethan hesitated. "Are we sure about this?" he asked, his voice tight. "We don't have a choice," Jenna replied, clutching her flashlight tightly. "The answers are in there." The heavy wooden door groaned as we pushed it open, revealing a spiral staircase winding up into darkness. The smell of mildew and decay hit us immediately, thick and choking. Our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom, their beams casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls. As we climbed, the oppressive silence of the tower was broken by faint, unnatural sounds, an echo of whispers, like a distant conversation just beyond comprehension. I glanced at the others, but no one spoke. The whispers grew louder the higher we climbed, until they seemed to press against our eardrums, overlapping and chaotic. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Jenna whispered. "It's voices." But they weren't voices. Not really. They weren't human. When we finally reached the top, the room was almost as we expected, empty, save for the clock's massive inner workings. The gears, rusted and ancient, stood like a forgotten skeleton of metal and time. The bell loomed above us, its surface inscribed with faint, glowing runes that pulsed rhythmically, as though in time with a heartbeat. "What are those?" Ethan asked, pointing at the runes. Jenna stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the strange carvings. "They're binding symbols," she murmured. "This isn't just a clock, it's a prison." "A prison for what?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. Before Jenna could answer, the runes flared brighter, filling the room with an unnatural light. The whispers grew deafening, and the air turned icy. The gears began to creak, moving for the first time in decades, and the bell swung gently, emitting a faint, ominous chime. I felt it then, a presence, cold and vengeful, something ancient and wrong, trapped within the tower. The whispers coalesced into a single, guttural voice that reverberated through the room. "Release me!" The air grew heavier, and my chest tightened. I felt as though the tower itself was pressing down on us, demanding obedience. Jenna's voice broke through the din. "It's feeding on them," she said, her words trembling with urgency. "The people who die, it's taking their souls, binding them here to fuel itself." "Then we have to stop it," Ethan shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the growing roar of the tower's malevolence. The bell tolled again, and I felt a sharp, icy pain in my chest. It was then I understood. It wasn't just feeding, it was choosing its next victim. And if we didn't act fast, one of us would be next. The descent from the tower was a blur of frantic footsteps and whispered arguments. By the time we stumbled out into the cold night, the air outside felt lighter, but only slightly. The curse's presence lingered, a malignant force that seemed to pulse through the town itself. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice edged with panic. "We can't just leave it like that." Jenna pulled a weathered notebook from her bag, flipping through its pages with trembling hands. "There has to be a way to break the curse. If it was bound to the tower, there has to be a ritual to undo it." Ethan frowned. "And what happens if we fail? If we mess up, what then?" "Then more people die," Jenna snapped. "We don't have time to argue." We reconvened at my house, Jenna's flashlight illuminating the notebook as we pored over its pages. The text described the original ritual, the one Matthias Cole had performed to bind the spirit to the Clocktower. It was a desperate act meant to protect the town, but it had gone horribly wrong. Instead of neutralizing the spirit, he had only angered it, trapping it in an endless cycle of vengeance. "To break the curse," Jenna read, "we have to reverse the ritual, perform it inside the tower at midnight, and offer a sacrifice." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. "What kind of sacrifice?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Jenna's voice was barely audible. "A life." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on us. None of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. Then Sarah stood, her expression hardened by determination. "We don't have a choice," she said. "If we don't do this, people will keep dying. Maybe all of us." She was right, of course. The tolling would continue. The spirit would choose its victims, one by one, until it was sated, if it ever could be. We had no choice but to face it. The hours leading up to midnight were filled with tense preparations. Jenna gathered the materials needed for the ritual: candles, salt, and a dagger etched with protective runes. Each item felt heavy in my hands, weighted by the knowledge of what we were about to do. As the clock approached midnight, we returned to the tower, the shadows of its spire stretching long and dark under the pale moonlight. The door groaned open once more, and we climbed the spiral staircase in silence, each step a reminder of the weight we carried. The bell began to swing as we reached the top, its sound louder than ever. The runes on its surface pulsed with a furious light, and the air crackled with energy. The spirit was waiting. Jenna arranged the candles in a circle around the bell, her hands shaking as she lit them one by one. The salt formed a protective barrier, though none of us felt safe. The dagger gleamed in the dim light, a grim reminder of the price we might have to pay. "Are we ready?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the roar of the tower. None of us answered. The ritual began. And so did the nightmare. The air in the Clocktower was suffocating, thick with an unseen force that seemed to push against my chest. The glow of the runes intensified, casting long, twisted shadows that danced across the stone walls. Jenna knelt in the center of the circle, her voice steady as she chanted the incantation from the notebook. Her words seemed to echo unnaturally, layering over themselves as if something unseen were repeating them in a mockery of her voice. Sarah gripped my arm tightly, her eyes locked on the bell above us. It swayed in perfect rhythm, each movement slower than the last, as though it were savoring the moment before the next toll. The first flicker of terror came when the whispers began again. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words, fractured and overlapping, in a language I couldn't understand. The voices grew louder, filling the room until they seemed to pour from the very stones around us. One voice rose above the others, deep and guttural, vibrating through my bones. "Fools! You cannot undo what has been bound!" The runes flared bright, then dimmed, their light pulsing like a dying heartbeat. Jenna's voice faltered, her chant breaking as she gasped for breath. The oppressive force in the air grew stronger, and the ground beneath us trembled. Ethan grabbed her shoulder, shouting over the din. "Keep going! We're out of time!" The bell tolled. Dome! The sound was deafening, rattling through my skull and drowning out all other noise. My knees buckled under the weight of the sound, and I pressed my hands to my ears, but it was no use. The chime wasn't just a noise. It was a force, an invisible hand squeezing the air from my lungs. The shadows on the walls twisted, elongating into impossible shapes. One by one, they peeled themselves free, sliding across the floor like living smoke. They surrounded us, their forms shifting and writhing, eyes like hollow voids fixed on us with a hunger that turned my stomach. Sarah screamed as one lunged toward her, its jagged, claw-like limbs slashing through the air. She stumbled back, crossing the salt line, and the thing recoiled with a hiss, its form shuddering violently before retreating to the edges of the room. "The circle!" Jenna shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "Stay inside the circle!" The bell tolled again. Dome! The runes pulsed with blinding light, and the bell's vibrations sent cracks spidering through the walls. Jenna's chant rose in desperation, her voice trembling, but unwavering as she read the final lines of the incantation. "By time undone, by bonds unmade, let the captive be cast to shadow and fade." The shadows shrieked, their forms writhing as if the words themselves burned them. The spirit's voice bellowed in fury, its guttural tones shaking the tower. "You dare defy me? You are mine." The bell swung wildly, its chime growing louder, faster, each note sending waves of icy pain through my body. My vision blurred, and I fell to my knees, the oppressive force bearing down on me like a lead weight. Then, everything stopped. The bell froze mid-swing, and the shadows stilled, their forms melting into pools of black at our feet. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the tower was silent. I thought we had succeeded, until I looked at Jenna. She was standing now, her face pale and eyes wide, her lips moving silently. The dagger was in her hand, its blade glinting in the eerie light of the runes. She stepped toward the bell, her movements slow and unnatural, as if pulled by an invisible string. "Jenna," Ethan called, but she didn't respond. The spirit's voice rumbled again, softer now, yet dripping with malice. "A sacrifice was promised. It will be given." Before any of us could react, Jenna raised the dagger, her hand steady as she plunged it into her own chest. "Jenna!" I screamed, reaching for her, but it was too late. Blood blossomed across her shirt, and she collapsed to her knees, her body shaking as the dagger fell from her grasp. The runes flared one last time, their light burning so bright I had to shield my eyes. A deafening roar filled the room as the bell let out a final, mournful toll. Dome! When the light faded, the room was still. The shadows were gone, the runes extinguished. The bell hung silent in the belfry, its surface dull and lifeless. Jenna lay motionless on the floor, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, but the silence that followed was heavier than any sound. We carried her down the tower, the sun rising as we emerged into the cold morning air. The town was quiet. The deaths had stopped, but the clock tower loomed above us, its dark silhouette a reminder of the price we had paid. As we laid Jenna to rest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly won. The clock tower was silent, but its presence remained, watching, waiting. And deep in my bones, I knew the curse wasn't broken. It was only biding its time.